So good evening, everybody. We'd like to welcome you all here to Union Seminary for tonight's event. I'm Fred Davey. I'm the Executive Vice President here at Union. And on behalf of our President, the Reverend Dr. Serene Jones, I want to bring you greetings. And we have a couple of things going on here tonight. We have with us members of a gathering that we've had here all week called the Millennial Leaders Program. And these are millennial persons from around the country who are involved in various forms of civic and community and social justice engagement. And we have gathered them here, as we have for the last 5 summers, primarily to network, to hear from other people in the field, particularly people who've been in the field of social justice work for quite a while, and to enjoy New York City for those people who are not from the city itself. And in addition to the Millennial Leaders Program, we have organized here at Union a project called the Union of Affirming Christians. And this work, supported by the Arcus Foundation for the last 4 years, has focused on bringing together mainly Christians, mainly evangelical Christians, who support a inclusive public policy and social and cultural agenda that includes the LGBTQ community. And it was very important for us here at Union to engage with Christians, evangelical Christians, who have a more progressive and open and inclusive approach to LGBTQ issues, because what we were hearing in the press and more of what you see in the public are Christians and evangelical Christians particularly who oppose a more inclusive society. And we wanted to say to the world, say to the nation, that those folks don't speak for everyone, that there are people who have a different sense of the gospel, who understand their faith walk in a very different way, who really do express and have compassion in their hearts, a deep sense of justice, and a commitment to a world order that's much more inclusive and supportive than what we hear coming from many Christians and other believers in the world and in this country today. So that group, this Union of Affirming Christians, is now up to north of 70 leaders from around the country. We have held a number of national gatherings. We've had several regional gatherings. We've done a series of press events in Washington, D.C. We've met with elected officials, and we have most recently shared a petition asking Christians, particularly evangelical Christians, to support a more inclusive public policy agenda that includes the LGBTQ community. And as of today, there are 52,000 people from around the country who signed that petition. And sometime soon, we're going to have a public event around the sharing of that petition and calling even more people from around the country to join this effort. If you tonight would like to join this group of Union of Affirming Christians, you can go to affirmingchristians.org, affirmingchristians.org, and simply sign up. And someone will be in touch with you. We will continue to communicate with you and hope that you will join us and be a part of this ministry. It's also my pleasure tonight to introduce to you the person who's going to moderate our panel. And then he will introduce the panel members. Most of you know Jonathan Merritt. I'm sure he's not a stranger to many of you. I know him from The Atlantic, but some of you probably know him from Religion News Service, from other work that he has done with other publications such as USA Today. He has also been a very influential voice with and among contemporary evangelicals. And among all the other things he's done, he has written a new book. This book is called, you can applaud if you want, this book is called Learning to Speak God from Scratch. Now, we have copies of this book, but there's a hitch to this. You get a free copy tonight, but we're going to ask you to go online and then pre-order another copy that you're going to give as a gift to somebody. Maybe order 2 copies. And then if you're feeling really generous, then you can order 5. But they're back on the table. I'm sure Jonathan would be willing to sign them for you before you go. But it's my pleasure to introduce to you our moderator for the night, Jonathan Merritt. Jonathan.
So thank you for that. Yes, please order 5 copies. That would be fantastic. Well, I'm going to offer some opening remarks before we get started to sort of frame the conversation. We have gathered in this room tonight with a singular purpose, to wrestle with a singular question: where do we go from here? And the word "here" in that question is specific, not general. Following the election of Donald Trump, America has entered a time of division and polarization unlike we've witnessed in at least a generation, certainly not in my lifetime. We're now divided not just by political affiliation, but by race and religion, gender and sexual identity, and of course by differing visions of what makes this country in some sense great. Where do we go from here? The word "we" in that question is also specific and not just general, because it's directed to those of us in this room, not only those of us in this room, but certainly those of us in this room who consider ourselves to be followers of the Jesus way. Monolithic we are not, but we are bound together by a common ethic of love, a common text in the Hebrew Scriptures and the Christian New Testament, and we hope a common commitment to being the hands and the feet of a man who 2 millennia ago asked us to love God and love neighbor above all else. Where do we go from here? In order to answer this question, I think that we have to recognize at least 3 things. First of all, this is not a new question. It's a question that Jesus followers have been forced to answer at various points of crisis in our religion's history. We ask this question following Roman persecution and European Crusades, the Great Schism of the 11th century, and the Protestant Reformation of the 16th and 17th, following the downfall of the Soviet Union and the downfall of the Confederate States of America. And here we are once more asking this question that seems to be perpetually at our doorstep. And by recognizing that tonight's question is not new, I think we're reminded that we're capable of answering it now. I think we also have to recognize that the moment that we now find ourselves in is in some ways a gift. You heard me correctly. The election of Donald Trump was in some way a gift. Now, before you start throwing tomatoes at me, let me explain. It has been said by many, and not just me, that the election of Donald Trump was indeed an apocalyptic event. By that, I don't mean that it signals the end of the world, although many days I wonder. But rather, it was apocalyptic in the sense that there was an unveiling. That this was an event that disabused us of lies about ourselves that we once believed to be truths. We can no longer pretend that we have moved beyond the scourge of white supremacy, much less racism of more common varieties. We can no longer pretend that we have truly wrestled with sexism and misogyny as a society. We can no longer entertain the illusion that LGBTQ equality was settled by the Supreme Court. The election of Donald Trump tore down the veil and has disillusioned us. Episcopal writer Barbara Brown Taylor points out that disillusionment by definition is the loss of illusion. It's the replacement of a lie with the truth, and though it is almost always a painful thing, it's almost always a good thing as well. The third thing that I think we must recognize is that even though we're faced with a daunting task, and even though our present moment is one of intense emotion, we must not forget that above all else, we are people who are called to love. Not just our neighbors, but also our enemies. And we are living in a moment in which our enemies seem to be replicating themselves all around us. On August the 16th, 1967, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered an address titled, "Where Do We Go From Here?" It was an address that urged his listeners to dream about how to reorder American society, and he began his speech with these words: "I'm concerned about a better world. I'm concerned about justice. I'm concerned about brotherhood. I'm concerned about truth. And when one is concerned about that, he can never advocate violence, for through violence you may murder a murderer, but you cannot murder. Through violence you may murder a liar, but you cannot establish truth. Through violence you may murder a hater, but you can't murder hate, not through violence. Darkness cannot put out darkness, only light can do that. And so I say to you, I have also decided to stick with love, for I know that love is ultimately the only answer to humankind's problems." And so for those of us who have gathered here who follow Jesus, I do believe, and I think I share this with many in the room, that love is still the answer, that love is always the answer, and that only by walking in that love can we truly forge a path forward. With that in mind, I want to turn and introduce to you our distinguished panelists, and then I'll welcome them all onto stage. Britt Barron is a pastor at New Abbey Church in Pasadena and a spiritual director at thechristiancloset.com. She is a speaker, a writer, a diversity and inclusion trainer whose work analyzes how faith, race, gender, and sexuality interact with our everyday lives. Yosef Sorid is an associate professor in the religion department and the Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia University, where he also directs the Center on African American Religion, Sexual Politics, and Social Justice. Jennifer Butler is the CEO of Faith in Public Life and former chair of the White House Council on Faith and Neighborhood Partnerships. She has spent years working in the field of international human rights, representing the Presbyterian Church USA. And George McHale is the executive director of Church Clarity, an organization which investigates, scores, and ranks church websites according to how clearly they communicate policies around LGBTQ+ inclusion and women in church leadership. Will you please welcome our panelists to the stage? All right, so we have three very important conversations to have around this tonight. One thing I will say is each of you, when you came in today, had something very important in your chair. It was an index card. And that index card is where, if you have a question, write your question down, because we're going to have some Q&A after this. If you cannot fit your question on an index card, you are not ready to ask it. So please make sure that you write down that card, and then we can get to as many questions as possible following this. So let's start with the topic of LGBTQ plus rights and inclusion. And I'd like to begin with a question for you, Britt. You're both an activist and a pastor, and in recent years, we've seen really something of a sea change, where especially among millennials, where marriage equality and trans rights have become very popular. They've been gaining support. I'm wondering, how do you see Christians continuing to move in this direction, or do you think that we're sort of at the end of a period of change as you've seen the things sort of change following the election of Donald Trump?
Yes. If I understood you, the question is sort of, okay, so first I would say Christians feels like too broad of a term these days, because if you're not careful, some of the loudest Christian voices seem to be moving in one direction, and then what I would consider some of the most transformed Christian voices are moving in the opposite direction. And so I think not only generationally are we moving towards more inclusion, but theologically that's moving with us, right? And that's one thing that I personally think about the gospel, is that it was always meant to be understood as we progress. Right? And so I think that's happening in a very beautiful way with LGBTQ sort of topics, is that we are realizing that the story was meant to get bigger. We are realizing the complexity of humanity and our theology. Like, we're just catching up to sort of where the story has always been, which I think is really beautiful. But like you said, I think the loudest voices are saying something different. And so it's sort of this in between.
Jennifer, maybe you can talk to that too, because you've probably seen some of the data in your work. I mean, how do you see this shaking out? Do you see that this is a trend that's continuing, that there's building more and more support among people of faith, different Christian communities, or do you think that trend is sort of slowing as the tides have changed?
There's sort of both things going on. Like, we won on gay marriage and equality, in part because the faith community was better engaged and better organized than it ever has been. We really led the way. And yet we're losing ground because the Christian right and conservatives in this country are now trying to use the concept of religious freedom to discriminate. So this noble concept of protecting other religions, we saw how important that was when Trump imposed the Muslim travel ban, or the Muslim ban. Now they're trying to use religious freedom to pass laws that say that religious businesses can discriminate against LGBT people. So it's kind of a rear guard battle, but it's a very powerful one, especially when they're about to select the next Supreme Court justice, who doesn't have a great track record on these issues. And it's one that can chip away at housing rights, employment rights, all kinds of bread and butter issues that are really important to the LGBTQ community, and can create a sort of backlash that we need to speak out against very loudly as Christians. I mean, who better to speak about what religious freedom really is than Christians? Mm-hmm. You know, that is not my religious freedom, and I don't want to see my religion used to discriminate against any group of people.
Just to follow up, to put maybe a fine point on that, is this broad question of where is the fight now concentrated? I mean, a few years ago, before the Supreme Court weighed in on it, it was all about marriage equality, and that's where all the energy was. Is what you're saying, sort of the energy and the resources, have they now shifted to these so-called religious liberty debates? Is that really the fight of our current moment?
I think it is, because they marriage is the law of the land, but they're going to use religious liberty as a guise to shut LGBTQ people out of employment, out of certain housing. They're going to use it for discrimination, and I think that is the epicenter of things. We saw that in the Masterpiece case that was ruled on recently by the Supreme Court, and we're seeing that all over the country, state by state. They are introducing laws to discriminate in the name of religious freedom. We've been fighting those off in Georgia since 2014. And actually, the cool thing about what's happened in Georgia is the religious community stood up and opposed the laws that were introduced to discriminate against LGBTQ people. We also won some battles in Jacksonville, Florida, in very conservative areas of the country. But the tricky thing is it's a Trojan horse, because people think religious freedom, it sounds fine, right? It sounds okay. They don't even really, they're not even clear about what they're actually doing. And then there are all these loopholes in the law to enable an employer to discriminate against somebody because they're LGBTQ.
Mm-hmm. Joseph, tell me, I don't want to totally conflate this struggle with previous struggles in our nation's history. However, you've got sort of a broad view in history. Tell us maybe, have we seen something like this before? Are the bones of this kind of an old problem, an old fight for equality that we've seen before, or is this problem really a new and distinct problem?
Yeah, so, I mean, thank you, first of all, Jonathan. Thank you to Union for the invitation to be part of this conversation. I mean, I think in a historical view, there's great work that looks at the complexities of organizing for justice around the institution of marriage. I think of my colleague at the law school here, Catherine Franke, who's written great work about the Reconstruction era and how sort of LGBT equality organizing might have learned from the efforts to separate and prevent the unification of black families after Reconstruction era. I think, though, in light of this sort of earlier conversation, one of the things I was also thinking about is the degree to which marriage was ever the full measure, right? Sort of we can understand the significance of marriage as a sort of public achievement of equality, but especially as it relates to sort of the connections that Franke's drawing to African American communities. Was marriage ever the sort of arbiter of where black LGBTQ folks were? So it points to questions of housing, it points to questions, a host of more specific issues that affect the living and doing of LGBTQ folk of all colors in the here and now. And so I think it invites a sort of attention to those more specific issues in the aftermath of the appearance of marriage's victory.
You know, you have sort of a bird's eye view because of as a scholar and the work that you do. When someone sits in your chair 30 or 40 years from now, what do you think that they will say about the way that American Christians and various American Christian communities handled this issue in the early 21st century?
Wow. So to ask the historian to be the prophet, that's fine. No, that's great. I mean, I think in some ways I think of your opening remarks, and then I think of Britt's initial pushback on the idea of sort of where Christians are now. I mean, I think we look at the long history of evangelicalism, and Christians have always been all over the map. And in some ways, this is a shoring up of old fault lines that are amplified in different ways in light of new questions. And then I think over the long haul, I think historians might highlight then, as they would now, that folks who have lined up on the progressive side, which is typically under-resourced, as we were talking about before, have always been the minority, right? And if I were to think on more biblical terms, that's sort of a remnant that is sort of fighting for the cause that is valued on a more public scale. So I think in many ways that longer arc would be viewed, and I think there might be some excitement after a long 40 years of attention to the religious right, to the renewed interest by journalists and others in the religious left. That right has gained a new hearing in recent years, and maybe will receive some renewed resources maybe as we move forward, and it won't just be a moment.
I want to ask George, I want to ask you a question, because your work with Church Clarity has centered in on churches and their positions on this topic. And Church Clarity is focused on helping churches clearly communicate their positions on LGBTQ equality. And I think it's important that we talk about churches. We have to talk about religious and political organizations. We have to talk about individuals. And I think churches are an incredibly important part of this conversation. Why does clarity matter? Why is it important that churches, I know there are a lot of churches that hear the things that we are talking about, and there's a lot of tension and there's a lot of emotion. And it's easy for a church to say, I'll just sit this one out for now. I'll wait till the dust settles. I'll let some other people go over the hill and take the bullet. Why is it important, do you think, that churches in this moment speak clearly about their views and their policies on LGBTQ relationships and rights?
Yeah. Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks for having me, Union. I would say that we're in a moment where if churches don't become clear, the reason clarity matters is because if they can't clarify what their actual policies are, then we risk having LGBTQ people in the future be second-class citizens within churches. Sort of what we saw with how the church treats divorced people, where it's like, yeah, sure, we can't really avoid this anymore, so I guess if you're divorced, you can be here. But the way divorced people, in my experience as a pastor, are treated within churches is still like there's like this stigma, there's this second-class citizenship. And I worry about if we let ambiguity thrive in churches for too long, the same thing is going to happen, where, like you're saying, they're kind of waiting to see where the wind blows, and then they're going to pretend like they've always been inclusive. And so at Church Clarity, we insist that clarity is reasonable. And to kind of go back to that first question, I think if you're watching everything that's happening right now and you haven't become inclusive, I'm just like, what are you waiting for, first of all? And also, like, I'm just really skeptical that institutions and organizations are going to do the work necessary in this environment to make that move. At this point, it's like the ship has kind of sailed. There's going to be exceptions, but I don't think we're going to see like very many huge churches or institutions make this shift for any other reason other than it becomes beneficial.
What do you say to the pastor who pushes back on that and says, you know, these issues are better worked out in person, face-to-face, in relationship, rather than codified policies and position statements on the internet? How do you respond? Because I hear that, I know you hear that a lot. How do you respond to that sort of rebuttal?
My favorite one is, we don't have a policy, which is that's just not true. So that's how we respond to it, is we're not after your theology. We're not looking for what your view is on Romans. Like, what's your policy? What is your actively enforced policy? If my queer friend comes up to you and says, will you perform my wedding? What are you going to say? Yes or no? It's that simple. So you can't really dance around it. And yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but we just kind of cut out all the noise. We stopped arguing about theology a while ago.
Britt, tell me, you're a person who's both worked on this as an issue and you're also working in a church pastorally. What has your church experience taught you about how churches should engage this issue?
Yeah, I think it's right along with what George was saying. Before I was a pastor where I am now, which is a fully affirming and inclusive community, I was a pastor at an evangelical megachurch that had just the most foggy, vague, like, sidewinder answer to this question. And I think this work is particularly important because I think I existed in a church community where it was left so vague that there were many queer people at that church who for sure thought it was affirming, and it 100% was not. It was barely encouraging of women in leadership, like on the low leadership level, and to see people in the pews and who I know were experiencing a different way, it felt bad. And I was just talking to someone out there, and the problem is, I think it's the insidious part of it is churches are doing that intentionally because they know it's not going to be favorable. Like we were saying earlier, like the ship has sailed, the train has left the station, we are progressing, we are moving forward, and they know that, and they're choosing to hide this 4 layers deep in their website because they're afraid of the backlash. When I'm like, look, okay, if you're not going to be affirming, don't be affirming, but own it. Say that, and experience what every queer person has experienced already, which is, pushback and rejection and having to defend what you believe and why you feel like you get to exist. Let's have that conversation then.
Before we transition in a minute, I do want to bring up an important topic related to this, which is reparative therapy and sort of that ex-gay movement, which is trickling off, thankfully. But there are many people who've experienced that sort of thing in the evangelical church, and I'm wondering, maybe for the two over here, if there are any thoughts or resources about people who are healing sort of from the PTSD of being in those kinds of communities, and maybe if you could provide there some historical insight or even insight about legally what's happening with reparative therapy for minors in this country and how we can begin to think about that. So weigh in whenever or whomever is ready.
I think the only thing I can really offer is to say that I don't think it's necessarily trickling off as much as we had hoped. I think we're kind of starting to see a resurgence in it, and it's just like everything else, it's being repackaged and communicated as, well, this isn't reparative therapy because that's really bad. It's, something, I don't even know what they're trying to call it, but they're still doing the same thing of trying to bring people in, bait them in with, we love you, and, you're totally welcome here, and then do the work of trying to change you. So I don't know what you call that other than reparative therapy, but
Yeah, it's interesting you say it's being repackaged, because there was a tweet actually that I'm pulling up that Desiring God put out, which is, if you don't know this, there's a pastor named John Piper, a new Calvinist, and there's a very popular website called Desiring God. They have 475,000.2 thousand followers, but it says 4 ways to engage your LGBT neighbors and friends. 1, show that you're for them, not against them. Check. Okay, that's good. 2, listen to their story. Good, that's great. 3, explain how the gospel puts all of us on level ground. Fine, good. 4, share how Jesus offers a better way, which in other words means, can, I assume, make you straight or help you be celibate. And so there are a lot of people, I think, that enter into these communities and end up feeling like they were led all the way weeks and months, and then they were tricked. But any thoughts maybe from you about people who've been in churches who've been burned, LGBTQ people who've been burned in churches who are looking for resources to heal? Anything that you would say as a minister?
Yeah, I think, well, on a practical level, like the Christian Closet, there's they have therapists that are specific to queer Christians. Because I think there's I know when I first went to therapy and my therapist didn't grow up in the evangelical church, and I was like, you don't know what these purity pledges did to me. I'm trying to, there's a miss there. And so it's really helpful to I think, be in therapy with someone who is going to understand the nuances of the evangelical church. I think I'm so happy we live in a time where there are so many resources, like podcasts and therapy and all these things that are saying the opposite, but it's so much time. And I think part of it is if you're on the other side, if you've made it, go and start grabbing people, is what I feel like we're doing is oh my gosh, we got to make sure, people know the churches aren't safe. We got to make sure people know this is repaired. We got to make sure people know this, because lives are at stake.
Any comments on the political realities and the fights that are happening right now? That many people may not even know that there are political battles happening right now when it comes to reparative therapy for minors.
Yeah, so it is a major policy issue because, again, our Constitution guarantees religious freedom. So our government is supposed to protect the ability of religious groups to practice whatever they believe. And yet they can only do that insofar as it does not cause harm to others. Right, and reparative harm therapy is harm to others. We know that it's extremely destructive, and yet when it comes to implicating healthcare to implementing healthcare insurance or Catholic hospitals, which are the hospital for many communities, there are no other hospitals. Then how is this government, with Trump in power and with a new Supreme Court, going to see reparative therapies? Are they going to ensure that that's part of our healthcare system? And so there are major battles shaping up around that, and it's something we need to watch very carefully. And again, your voices are critical, because as religious leaders, you can speak to that issue in a more impactful way than most people in our society, because it's not religious freedom to insist on reparative therapy when it does harm and is proven to do harm to others.
Yeah, and the debate, to be clear, is really about minors. I mean, if you're an adult and you want to engage in some sort of therapy, that's your own business, but it's parents putting their 13-year-old children in therapies that are proven time and time again to be incredibly harmful to them psychologically and emotionally. Joseph, I want us to transition a little bit and talk about the topic of women in leadership. So that's maybe a funny place to start, because I'm starting with a male. But I want to start with you because I want to ask a generational question, and you work with college students. And I'd like to ask what you sense among your students compared to other generations. I mean, do you think that when we're talking about gender equality, women in leadership in religious institutions, do you think that there is some sort of marked generational divide? Do you find that millennial Christians are more supportive or are overwhelmingly supportive of women in leadership within the church at the highest levels?
That is I find that, at least speaking as a professor, my sample pool may not be the most helpful, which is to say that many of them don't bring a robust religious language to the classroom, and those who, and there are, at a place like Columbia, a very strong evangelical presence and a Christian presence, but often they buy the language of evangelical embattlement and feel that that those views are not welcome in the classroom. They presume the secular orthodoxy or progressive orthodoxy of the classroom, and so often reluctant to make claims. So I don't know that the students that I've had in the classroom are, other than anecdotal evidence, where there are, I have had a student here or there who are very much struggling with the very clear gender hierarchies that they have observed in the classroom and don't square with the kind of education or discourse given the very strong feminist tradition at Columbia University, which they are finding a voice in and don't see that represented in the communities that they come from. And that's across racial lines, but within religious communities. So that's a long way of saying I'm not quite certain, but that it is definitely something that the students are grappling with in real ways.
And when you look at all generations as a historian, I've heard a lot of people say, we're really beyond this. This debate is over. But I see a lot of energy in evangelical communities for, so-called gender roles and complementarianism. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. And I think, there are certain spaces where, women have been appointed to the highest of offices, yet, I've had other folks in here, I think more of students have come through a place like Union Theological Seminary, which will say, while a church may entertain women on ministerial staff, but there's still nobody who's going to serve in leadership of the deacon board, So the sort of questions of where the real authority is held, certain symbolic positions of power are achieved, but that redirect our attention to other places that say that the battle has certainly not been won. And certainly, I think across lines, the sort of public prominence of this complementarianism of the co-pastor, the wife has the covering of her husband and has a degree of public power, but is only insofar as that power is licensed and authorized by the husband, is often pointed to as a claim for equality, but then sort of opens up a longer conversation of the way in which that gender norm stays in place.
Jennifer, when you engage organizations on issues like this and you have evangelicals push back, what is the pushback? What is the, yes, there's sort of like arguments from the Bible and whatnot, but what do you hear when people when they resist these notions of gender equality and women in leadership in the church? Can you maybe articulate for us a little bit about what you hear from the other side?
Yeah. So it's this doctrine of complementarianism, that basically men and women are separate but equal, right? Yeah, like anybody's buying that, right? So, and I can't believe that doctrine is back, and that it seems to be gaining steam in certain circles, and there's a certain sort of nostalgia about it. And so that's the argument they use. What's different than it was in my day? So I met my first woman minister when I was in college. And that was I was in the Southern Baptist tradition at that time. And that was right before the Southern Baptist takeover, and they started purging women from leadership in the Southern Baptist Convention. So then I decided to leave the Baptist church and leave the evangelical tradition, become Presbyterian, and get ordained. And at the time I was at Princeton Seminary, and there was an enormous backlash then against women in ministry from a conservative resurgent group in our denomination that was being funded from the outside. So then what's changed today that I think is important to note is that evangelical women have today have this incredible pulpit that my generation didn't have, and that's social media. So you see people like Jen Hatmaker and Beth Moore being able to call out President Trump and being able to talk about the sexual abuse comments that he made right before the election, and have a platform and not get shut down. They get shut down in other ways through hazing and trolling and They might lose some followers and stuff, but they basically have maintained their platform. Whereas, in my day when I was coming along early on, they would just bar women from being ordained and having leadership in the church. So that's been really cool to see, this young generation of so many women with far more followers than a lot of these men being able to take the conversation over.
What do you, Britt, maybe you could speak to this too. I mean, now we have the whole Me Too movement and the whole Church Too movement and social media that's played into this. How has that changed the conversation or maybe even shifted the power? Or do you think it has at all?
I think it definitely has. I think social media has played a huge role. And I think it's, when we look at women in ministry, right, there's this, it's always been a grind, right? And I think there's this childhood development idea called an extinction burst. Like if you're wanting a child, like you keep telling the child to stop doing that, stop hitting that, and then they're like, okay, I'm serious. You know what I mean? Like I'm gonna count to 3 or whatever, and then they'll just one last time. And I feel like that's what's happening to men in our society is they feel the power slipping out of their hands and they're like, one last time, I'm going to just really go for it. And Gilead is coming. And so I think that's what we're seeing. Like in a lot of ways, I think with race, we're seeing that and with gender, we're seeing that of, yes, I think the power is still, there's a lot of power in the patriarchy. There's a lot of still white supremacy in our country. But I think the powers that be are noticing some shifts, like Me Too, like Black Lives Matter. Like you can't just do these things anymore. We're starting to rise up, and they're sort of clamping up even tighter and bringing back some separate but equal stuff.
And I think we've even seen, in some ways, if you watched what unfolded in the Southern Baptist Convention this year, it took a while.
Yeah.
Kind of a shocking amount of time and a certain level of flagrancy for people to sort of start to wake up. But it is interesting that even in those corners, social media is able to penetrate. George, I want you to talk a little bit about why your organization, when you started out, and you were focused on LGBTQ policies and statements that churches make online. But then you added women in leadership, or you have at least recently added women in leadership. It was in your bio, so you must have. We talk about people coming into churches, and when it comes to LGBTQ issues, they don't know. My experience is by and large, you kind of know with women in leadership, but maybe I'm not a woman, so I don't have to be aware of this like a female walking into a church would be. Can you tell me what you've seen in terms of churches? Is there that same sort of bait and switch happening when it comes to women in leadership in churches?
Yeah, definitely. I think, so a little bit of background, I guess. We developed LGBTQ policy methodology for how we score first because it felt like the most sort of in the moment right now is what the church is dealing with, with a lot of urgency. So we started there, and because we frankly didn't know how to do all the other things that we want to do with the data that we're aggregating, because we're not stopping with women in leadership. This is just our second thing. We're 8 months old. So we started there. We developed women in leadership. We solicited feedback from women in leadership, in church leadership, because they are there. They are in leadership, whether or not you want to have them or think they can lead. It's just such a weird question. But we solicited their feedback, and they helped develop the methodology. And what we came to was, what was great, what worked with LGBTQ policy was we could ask straight yes or no questions. Will you perform a wedding? Can an LGBTQ person work here? With women in leadership, we had to take it a step further. Sort of what Joseph was just pointing out was this other layer of ambiguity where a church staff will be stacked with women in lower level positions, and then they'll be like, yeah, we're totally egalitarian. And so what we did was add not only policy but representation. So we score a church not just based on what they claim their policy is, but actually how they're living it out. And so our team, we have a team of 50 volunteers all around the world. They score these churches that are submitted through our crowdsourced form. We've done about 2,000 churches, and what we do is look at really detailed dynamics around how they make decisions. So as a woman at the table when your church actually makes a policy decision, or is she a children's director that you say, yeah, they can totally work here the same way that you're telling gay people, you're welcome here. So it is an issue, and women who work at churches, we've heard countless stories of they thought they could aspire to the highest levels of leadership, only to find out years after investing on a particular track or whatever, that no, they could only reach here, or that once they got to a certain level, it was going to be next to impossible to break that glass ceiling, so to speak.
Tell me, and this is open to all the panelists, who are some female leaders in the church that we've mentioned Jen Hatmaker and Beth Moore, who've become incredibly assertive online. Yeah. But are there any people out there, if you say like, man, I'd love to just be exposed to some female evangelicals who are really stepping out and leading? Any names that come to mind?
Yeah, Rachel Held Evans as well. And if you look at her Twitter feed in particular, she's just so deeply theological, ethical, and on point in terms of the politics and policy of the moment. And the conversations, like theology by Twitter, right? Like who would have thought you could do it in so few words, right? Or get spiritual nurture through Twitter. But like I regularly look at her feed every day for inspiration, and to see evangelicals who are still sort of coming out of the wilderness, I call it, really debating and grappling and hearing her voice. I think, she's Tracy Blackman in the United Church of Christ. She comes from multiple traditions, so even Pentecostal, so I would still count her as well. So it's pretty cool. There's a lot, I think, of women rising up. And the other thing that gives me hope in this moment is, and you've written so well about this, Jonathan, you might have more to add, and maybe we can ask you questions, but to see the architects of the Christian right, who are leaders in the Southern Baptist Convention, so Paul Pressler and
Paige Patterson.
I'm melting, so I'm forgetting the other guy's name. Yeah, but to see them taken down by the Me Too movement, and in part by women organizing, and by that Baptist sign-on letter, in a moment where we have a Trump president who is a serial abuser, of women. And it makes me wonder about this moment. We see great evil, and then we see incredible feats of activism at the same time. You called it an apocalypse. I'm not as poetic as you are. Sometimes I think of it as like a boil that's being lanced, and we're cleaning it out and getting rid of all the sexism and the racism that's out there. And hopefully we are, but there's a lot to be concerned about too in this moment. I mean, we have a president who just embraced Vladimir Putin before the world stage and rebuked his own intelligence advisors. And Putin, if you guys don't know it, is the world convener of white supremacy groups and a tyrannical leader, right? So he's actually fostering this sort of global division, and Trump is allying himself with Putin in the open without any challenge from his own party.
Any other names that you guys think of?
I think of Nadia Bolz-Weber. And then also, like, Austin Channing Brown just wrote an incredibly accessible book about race. And I think accessible language is super important at a time like this, because sometimes it can get so high level that we're kind of missing sort of a mark there. So I love, like you said, like Twitter, or like just putting it in really accessible language to sort of start to deconstruct and unpack these things. So those are my two faves.
So I was just going to make mention quickly. She's not necessarily as prominent in the public sphere, but a Union alum who, by the name of Leslie Callahan, who pastors his first woman pastor of a historic African American congregation. Sort of just like to follow what they're doing, and just within the last couple months, they moved this historic Black Baptist congregation to be LGBT affirming, and just the sort of way in which she is trying to connect the dots around race, gender, and sexuality in the life of a local Black church is just phenomenal to watch.
And I would just add, co-founder of Church Clarity, Sarah New, is an up-and-coming leader who, just a phenomenal immigrant, Asian American immigrant who identifies as queer and leads at a pretty high level in creating this database. So I think her voice is really important right now too. And she is traveling right now, or should be here tonight.
Well, I want us to definitely talk about racial justice, which is, a huge and incredibly important topic right now. And Joseph, I want to maybe kick off with you. In 2008, America elected its first black president, and there were lots of commentators who assumed that this sort of signaled some kind of leap forward in terms of racial reconciliation in America. But here we are. And roughly a decade later, we're seeing, these bold expressions of white supremacy and white nationalism. Can you tell me what the hell happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think you already have in some ways with your opening remark and sort of thinking through the term disillusioned, right? Certainly the cries for post-racial America have been a long time coming. And certainly, I mean, I think in some ways the sort of failure to reckon with history came all the more to the fore with this apparent symbolic achievement of racial equality, which is not to understate the fact that so many people were shocked that this would be achieved at this highest office, but yet again it sort of clarifies the degree to which sort of electoral politics are not necessarily always the measure of what's going on in the quotidian of every folks life, right? It's the black president in the age of mass incarceration, we could point to all the indices of racial injustice, and in fact, statistics would suggest that by a lot of measures, more African Americans are worse off than when legal equality was achieved. So in many ways, as much as Trump brings to the fore, or disabuses us of our illusion, I think Obama in the same regard. His coming to the fore did as well.
Do you think, when I think about American history, I do think about a certain level of reactivity. So something happens and then the culture sort of kicks back. A great example is the modern evangelical movement, which is in some ways a reaction to the American Cultural Revolution, in some ways purely the civil rights movement. Is Trump sort of America's answer to Obama? Is it sort of the reaction to what we got in 2008, that there was at least a faction of America that sort of reacted, and Trump is the human form of that?
I mean, I think that's a fair way to read the situation. I mean, with every sort of move forward on racial equality, you think end of slavery, Reconstruction, and then black codes. You think of lynching, you think of Ku Klux Klan, you think of Great Migration, you think of a renewed Ku Klux Klan. You think, right? I mean, this is very much the case. So it only makes sense that with the achievement of a black president, it would be followed by a white supremacist president, right? I mean, this is so at the level of, I mean, I think that, obviously, not to posit that clear of a causal connection, and I think we can look to the work of someone like Carol Anderson, who has made this argument about white rage and backlash as part of a long story, that with every move forward for equality, there is violent pushback. Yeah.
We are, and Brett, I want to direct this to you, we're now at the 5th anniversary of Black Lives Matter. 5 years ago, it just all started trending on Twitter. And in light of what we're seeing now, do you find that this movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, has been effective by and large? Are people more aware or more engaged in dismantling white supremacy as a result of this movement? Or is it just sort of proven to have been a lot of hype and a lot of social media, but not a lot of real tangible progress?
Yes, I think both and I don't know that this is the conversation I always get into. I was doing a workshop at a high school, and these two black students were arguing about who was more impactful, Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X. Whose methods were more impactful? Who did it better? And I think that the better question is, aren't we glad we had both of them? So when it comes to like a movement or shifting power structures or fighting against something, it has to be both and. There's going to be gaps no matter what you try to do. You do a social media movement, okay, it doesn't have enough action. You just do action, not enough people know about it. We need all of those gaps. And I think Black Lives Matter filled a huge gap, started a huge conversation, did get things moving. Are there other gaps that need to be filled still? Yes. But I don't think that means anything towards, stopping it or anything like that. I think we need people at every angle of this thing, because white supremacy is giant. So I think all the ways should be utilized.
George, as you've spent so much time looking at churches, looking at church websites, I mean, it's no secret that that American churches are still very much segregated. What are you seeing? Do you see signs of hope? Do you see that basically when you look at the breakdown of leadership and the breakdown of congregants that the needle hasn't really moved in the last 30, 40, 50 years? I mean, what are you seeing in terms of the way that churches themselves have been changing in this moment where we seem to be as a culture moving toward diversity, and yet we are still as divided as we've ever been?
Yeah, this one's probably the most depressing in the sense of what's happening in the field, I guess, so to speak. Every time you pull up a staff website on a church page, it's just all white faces. And there's exceptions, obviously. There's some diversity, but there's just not a lot of hope or sign that we're making any significant progress in our current paradigm. And I think, going back to the question of the night, where do we go from here? I mean, we have to really look at how we're making decisions from the bottom up in terms of hiring and representation, and then from a clarity standpoint, as we develop a methodology around racial justice, which is coming hopefully within the next several months, we've been thinking a lot about what can we actually nail churches down to, right? Because unlike LGBTQ policy or even women in leadership, race is tricky through the lens that we've created so far, because you can't really ask definitively, are you a white supremacist church, yes or no, and expect to get a helpful answer. So we can apply some of the metrics for representation, and that's most likely what we'll do, but we're really waiting to see what comes up in terms of how we can approach this in a way that actually confronts churches and says, you say you have a Black Lives Matter banner outside, what does that look like for you? And those are really uncomfortable conversations, because usually the answer is, well, it's a banner, and it's somewhere. We got to start somewhere. But the church is so woefully behind on this one that it's just really depressing.
That sort of tees up something that I want to ask Jennifer, because so many churches will check the box. If you say, hey, do you believe in X, Y, and Z when it comes to this issue? Oh yeah. Particularly white evangelical churches, they will check the box. They may have the language in their mission statement of every tribe and creed and race and all of these sorts of things, but they don't actually do anything. I was at the Southern Baptist Convention this year, and I always say, when all is said and done, more has been said than done when it comes to the SBC. But that's pretty true of white evangelicals in a lot of ways when it comes to race, that there's a lot of saying and not a lot of doing. What can they do? I mean, there are a lot of folks out there that would like to engage their pastors and their church leadership to get involved in terms of activism or these political conversations. But if somebody comes to you and says, what's a starting point for my church? What do you tell them to do in this moment?
It's a great question. Well, one, sign up for our network at faithandpubliclife.org, because we'll give them plenty of opportunities to weigh in their local community. So let me tell the story of what's happening in Columbus, Ohio. About a year before Trump was elected, we started a clergy convening of Black and white pastors in Columbus. And what was most stirring to me was after the first meeting, one of the white clergy turned to one of the leaders of the group and said, "That is the first time I've ever sat down with one of my Black clergymen in this community. First time." Now, that's on him, right? So the first thing we need to do is start talking across lines. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. Whites live on the north side, Blacks live on the south side. That's due to a history of segregation. So as clergy, as lay leaders, we absolutely have to get outside our neighborhood. And in Atlanta, that can mean driving an hour. I mean, that's how segregated we are, right? And we have to start building those relationships. So now the group in Columbus, they talked about, started some anti-racism training. Trump was elected. So we had to have a conversation about Trump and why white Christians are voting majority for Trump. And then we started to tackle criminal justice reform in Ohio. And we started an initiative where we started sitting down with the police chief and with the mayor. And we've been able to hold them accountable to some reforms that are going to reduce police brutality in the city. And we're going to continue to escalate those asks. So that's the kind of thing that we need to be doing. We need to be having one-on-one conversations, building relationships, building trust, including with the Muslim community, with the immigrant community. We've been building networks state to state to work on immigration reform. The criminalization of black bodies is also happening to brown bodies. And we see that when people have the gall to rip a nursing babe from its mother's arms and put that baby in jail, right? So criminalization is happening across the board, and we need to be in relationship with each other and talking to each other, and then we need to act. And that's going to cause some people to leave the pew, and that is going to require that we also take to the streets. Because again, we have a white supremacist president with a white supremacist administration, and our president's clearly putting his arm around the biggest tyrant in the world.
Well, we are about to transition to audience questions, so make sure, remember, you've got to be able to put your question on that index card. But before we do, I want to ask a final question of Joseph and Britt about the role that white Christians should be playing. Because, you know, on the one hand, it's like, yes, we need to speak up. We need to be having these conversations. And then it's like, yeah, but shouldn't we actually be empowering people of color to speak? And then it's like, well, now I'm empowering you, right? And so then, or I'm putting a burden on you to fix a problem that you didn't start. Sometimes I know there are a lot of folks in evangelical communities who really struggle with this. Is what role are what is the most helpful role that white Christians can play in this moment when it comes to race debates in America?
I mean, part of me is like, that's a question for white people. Because, you know, you tell me. But I think I get that, right? Because I know there are certain communities that I have wanted to be an advocate for, but didn't have access to, and was very confused and hesitant as to how and when, and had some conversations with people in my life who were very gracious. And so I get the tension. While mostly I think it's a question for white people, I think I always say, if I had unlimited time and resources and was good at this, I would write children's books for white kids that highlighted awesome white leaders and people from the civil rights movement, white abolitionists, because I think we need to start shaping a generation of white people where they see there are many kinds of white people, and I want to be like them instead of all white people are good, even though they just committed genocide. So I think that's like a helpful thing to do for the next generation. But as we stand now, I think white people need to start talking to each other more honestly about, yeah, this is awkward, but, you know, are you racist? I feel a little racist. Or however it goes, I don't know. Never been white.
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add other than white folk need to talk to each other and figure that out, because I've been in those conversations that inevitably rely on black folk to explain it, and like it's part of that reconciliation model. And you know, black folk don't have a moment in the week where we're not negotiating white people, and so often to have space that is segregated, if we want to call it that, is a bomb. It's a solve, right? And so I think at the end of the day, it is something that. And if you are working on, right, if white folk are working on racial justice, it's working through those intramural questions before then reaching out to, or what have you.
Yes, go ahead.
Someone who did this brilliantly was Colin Kaepernick, by the way. Is he just got in everyone's Sunday morning routine, and he forced you to have the conversation. That's why so many people got mad at him, because it's like, I just want to watch my football. But the problem is, like, no, you need to have these conversations. And just by taking a knee silently during the national anthem, he forced that. He forced white people to have a conversation. So it's a beautiful picture of what I think speaks to your question.
Yeah, thanks for that.
We see how that one went.
Yeah. So we want to turn to some audience questions. We're going to start. We have a question that our organizers have directed me to. Isaac, I'll let him step up to the microphone. He is doing his PhD in 20th century evangelicalism. So that is something to devote your life to right there. You have our sympathies. But I'll let him kick it off, and then if you want to step up to the microphone, don't be shy. We can take a few questions before we have our closing remarks.
So the question I would throw out to everyone, because this is a part of the question that I deal with and seek to answer in my dissertation, that is a alternative reading of 20th century evangelical history from the perspective of those who have been kicked out of evangelicalism or defined out of the label. And on a historical scale in the 20th century, that includes an evangelical feminist movement in the 1970s, a radical black nationalist evangelical movement that peaked in the 1970s as well, such that the argument is that this has become, in my argument, the defining factor of evangelical identity is by kicking folks out. So my question from our conversation tonight, though, was every time we mention evangelical, that is a slippery idea. And white evangelical is a very important qualifier because I would argue evangelical is a racialized label now, such that it carries connotations of whiteness with it. Whenever people say evangelical, what they mean is they are talking about
White supremacy.
White evangelical.
And is your question about the kicking out, or is it about the racialization?
Is it about
index cards? Index cards.
I know. My question is about. I didn't hear anybody talk about how we defined what evangelical means, because that is the factor. And those debates, when somebody gets kicked out, it's over defining what evangelical means, and they draw this line and say, no, you're beyond that now. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, reflect on what you think evangelical, what that word and label means, because the definition is very slippery.
Well, the word or label is going to change, depending on who you ask. But I think what's urgent right now, and some of the work that we're doing, is saying, I'm actually not super interested in deciding whether or not I'm going to use it. I think I've pretty much decided no, thank you, because Franklin Graham and those people have kind of sort of taken the reins of that. But I think the reason that we feel clarity is important is because we want to at least define it. Even if we're not going to associate with it, we want to say this is what it is. Now choose for yourself. If you want to call yourself that, great, I'm going to be over here. So I don't know if that answers the specific question, but it is hard to pin down, and we need to pin it down. But it's just like the word Christian, I would say, falls into a similar category. Or when someone says, well, this is biblically sound, or, the Bible is clear about this. All that stuff just needs to go away, and we need to just talk to facts. Here's what you mean by evangelical.
And I think Isaac also helps to, you're answering the question for us, which is to say, over the span of the last 30, 40 years or 50 years, because of a host of activists who've organized together and been well-resourced, evangelicalism has become aligned in the popular imagination with the right, a set of right politics, and with whiteness, right? But that there's a longer history that says evangelicalism is to be pro-abolition, is to be pro-women's equality, and so the religious left, in many ways, tries to reclaim that, right? So one could also make a claim that all of Afro-Protestantism is evangelical, but black folk mostly don't want to be associated with that white and right stuff for obvious reasons. So, yes. Quote Britt.
Anyone? Yeah?
How do we eradicate anti-blackness and lack of inclusion for minorities within the LGBTQ faith community? We can't just pretend that only the non-faith LGBTQ community has these ills.
That's a good question. Oh, I hear some snaps, yeah.
So the question is how to eradicate white supremacy within the LGBT community or anti-blackness?
Yeah, I think it would be such a miss to assume that white supremacy hasn't hit the LGBTQ folks just like it's hit everyone else, right? And so I think that is just such a misunderstanding that by someone having an oppressed social identity that now they're going to resonate with and understand and fight for all oppressed identities, and that just certainly hasn't been true. We see that with white women in particular, and white LGBTQ folks. And so I think The answer is yes, that it's there for sure. I think the answer of how do we becomes more nuanced into who are you, where are you, what access do you have, what people are you around. I think, again, to the previous comment on another question, I think it takes so many people doing so many things to make a movement. I think there are individual relationships that are important. I think there are activists, like going to the streets that's important. I think politically is important. I think religiously important. I think white supremacy is only going to be taken out from every single angle. But I think we need to first address the misunderstanding that LGBTQ folks do not also have white supremacy in that community.
And I think a couple things that we do is to acknowledge the folks who've been doing that work within something like the Metropolitan Community Churches. I think of Darlene Garner and Candy Holmes, who've been fighting that battle within the people of African diaspora group within MCC churches. I think of Yvette Flunder and the Fellowship of Affirming Churches, which have been fighting on behalf of black queer folk, black same-gender loving folk, so that work is being done as well. And just like white supremacy anywhere else, it hasn't quite been eradicated. But the fight is going on forcefully.
One quick thing on that is that I think it's important to insist on intersectionality and activism. And so if African American community is working on one issue, LGBT community, if it happens to be particularly white, is working on another. And we've had some success with that in places like Florida and North Carolina. Like, we have to be working on each other's issues, and we have to hold each other accountable to that.
First of all, thank you all for wonderful comments throughout. So my question is about sort of how these sorts of conversations actually take place and some of the barriers to these sorts of conversations. So how do Christians and non-Christians, for that matter, engage with some of the, as you called it earlier in the evening, loud anti-LGBT or white supremacist voices when there seems to be an unwillingness by a lot of those folks to acknowledge the theological legitimacy of more quote-unquote transformed voices? Some of the things I'm thinking of is we have Catholics in the United States who are claiming not my Pope, thinking about some of the stuff that Pope Francis is putting out. Or how do we get white evangelicals to listen when they outright dismiss black and brown theologians? How do those conversations then take place on a theological level?
I mean, from my perspective, we do a lot of work with the media, and when there are public policy issues that the faith community needs to weigh in on theologically and ethically, we try to get their voices up front. And I think a lot about this too, because I grew up in a conservative community in the South, right? And so I always want to say things so that my dad will frickin' understand, right? So I'm always thinking back to that. But I think it's important that we also, at some point, not worry about that as much, because as we speak, is everything okay back there? As we speak more loudly and more often and get heard, and I think the more progressive religious voices starting to get heard, we're going to be able to change the whole debate and the tenor of conversation the more they hear us and the more we speak very specifically to our faith traditions. And so I think what the Christian right has been able to do is they had a megaphone attached to them for a couple of decades, and they said crazy stuff. Really crazy stuff that nobody ever thought that they would ever believe. Amy Sullivan, the reporter, tells this great story of William Sloane Coffin, who taught here, right, going on the Phil Donahue show, which was like the Oprah of that day. And Phil Donahue was sitting next to Jerry Falwell, and he had this great opportunity on national television to launch a major progressive theological debate and take Falwell out. And he refused to do it because he really thought Falwell's argument was so preposterous that it was not going to go anywhere. Falwell was charming, wonderful, and eventually they took over the public debate. So we have to take that back, and it'll eventually start to sink in. Not everybody will come with us, but it'll eventually sink in, especially to a younger generation that is starving for that, in my experience.
I'm going to take a quick stab at this because I think that the work that we're doing is revealing 3 different categories. So you're either clear, you're not clear, you haven't decided yet. And it's important to acknowledge that there are clear churches that we score who have policies on both sides. So that group is really the only group that I want to deal with. The group that just doesn't even want to own where they're at, I say stop trying to engage with them. Stop, like Jen's saying, we need to create our own systems, our own infrastructure. We're only going to be able to do that if we're talking to people who know where they stand.
My question kind of piggybacks off what you two just said. I'm a church planter in New York City, just moved here. I'm planting a fully affirming and inclusive, anti-racist church that might have like a evangelical aesthetic at most. My question is, half of my people, we meet in the LGBT center down in the village, half of my people identify as queer. Basically all of them have had fallings out, have PTSD from evangelical churches that they've spent years loving, and then they've hit the ceiling, right, and had to leave. Then I talk with other people who are at these churches that are not affirming and want to affirm women in ministry, and I really do see my church and my ministry as like trying to pull these people out of those churches if they're not going to change. And I don't feel bad about that, but I wonder, with all the divisiveness and the sectarianism, is that like a good look? Is that a good ministry? Or like, because I don't want to be patient because I think lives are at stake. And so I don't want to wait for it. But these churches seem to be, and these people seem to be, and so I guess as a minister who's trying to offer a better, more inclusive expression, what would you all say about that?
I say hell yeah. You know, our church is similar, right? Like we're probably, 40 to 60% queer, depending on the Sunday and who woke up early. But yeah, I think once you're in community with people who have been hurt and you realize the type of hurt that a community like that can put on someone, there is a sense of urgency, right? It's not like, oh, well, I hope they come around one day. It's like, no, I'm gonna fight against this thing, and I think that's really important.
Thank you. I wish we had more than an hour, but we made good use of this time. I am United Methodist, and I don't know how many people in this room or in this conference have been following the issue in the United Methodist Church. It is since 1972, and I have been at General Conference, that this has been on the agenda, and that is LGBTQ in the pulpit. And now they're not really clear about same-sex marriage. So we're coming into a pre-General Conference in 2019 for the General Conference 2020. And we've talked a lot about evangelical churches. But the United Methodist Church is the second largest Protestant denomination in America. So to piggyback on the name calling, I think we have to open up and look at churches more in general, the people in the pew, not just the tag. And I was wondering how you felt about that.
Yeah, yes? To borrow Britt's phrase of the night, yeah. I mean, I think what's happening in denominations is it's unfortunate, but what it's going to force people to do is decide what their loyalty is. Is it to a denominational brand? Is it to, just the story of Jesus? Is it to biblical inerrancy? So all these conversations coming to a head is super interesting to watch. But denominations in general, in 2018, I think have a lot of work to do to maintain the relevance. I think denominations in general are exceedingly losing influence, and what do they even do anymore at a broad level? We have the organizing methods and technology and tools to do what denominations have done for so long. So I think it's even a bigger question of what do denominations even mean? What is the role that they play? Like you said, the label, so many people fight to keep a label that it just loses all meaning, I think, in a lot of ways.
I was going to say, I think what you've pointed to in United Methodism is is indicative of a sort of broader phenomenon in American religious history that scholars have been talking about now for decades, what now refers to as post-denominationalism, which says matters less whether you're Methodist or Presbyterian, but whether you find yourself on the right or left. And so you see these denominations splitting, right, or struggling to hold together or figure out who they're going to be in a new moment where that denominational identity is not clear how and why what it matters for the next moment. But I think that the battle that has come up back and forth again and again on the General Conference at the UMC is indicative of sort of the changing landscape of American Christianity.
Thank you. Thanks for that. We've got these last two questions, and then we'll have some closing remarks. Go ahead.
Hi. Thank you all so much for all the comments that you've made today. And I hope I hope everyone in this room takes this question as not a challenge, because I genuinely mean it as a question. But as an Asian American woman of color who is in leadership in my church, it's an evangelical church plant that just launched this past Easter, I really have been sort of struggling with, basically the question is, like, what would be like a Christian visionary future of, what the Asian American church and Asian American Christians, the kind of role that they have to play in the things that we've talked about today, whether it's LGBTQ plus inclusion or, racial justice and racial, multi-ethnic theology, or, women in the church, because the large part of like Presbyterian, in large part, a lot of the Asian Americans grew up in Christian households, et cetera, et cetera. So, and it's not something that we talk about. And since we're talking about things that Christians don't like to talk about tonight, I was wondering if you had thoughts on that, for my own sort of journey to that too.
I think the closest we've come to, we've stayed largely within the black and white frame for thinking about racial inequality, which you point to, right? It's the longstanding binary that has ordered racial inequality, but it's never captured the full complexity of who we are as a nation, ethnically, what have you. And so some of the immigration stuff maybe pushes in this direction, but not in the way in which we think about how Asian Americans, if we refer to Asian Americans as a singular community, but is to recognize that that sort of how questions of racial and ethnic diversity are also part of the conversation for thinking about American Christianity, and that the Asian Christian communities are also wrestling with these questions, but through a different experience, right? But that is part of a broader story of the Christian church. I don't know that there's a singular answer to it, but I think you've put it to us as something that has to be taken seriously.
Yeah, like I mentioned, I wish Sarah was here because she would have a phenomenal answer for this in her experience. I'll speak for myself as an Egyptian immigrant who was in the evangelical church, and after the election of Trump, looked around and sort of had scales fall from my eyes and realized, oh, you're all white, and you don't care really that much that Trump just won, and I'm over here like, oh my God, this is the end of the world, right? And so as I've sort of come out of that, I've found a lot of solidarity with former evangelicals of color who don't come out of the black tradition, because that's an entirely different experience. And so that solidarity is real. And so I think, a future would look like us continuing to find each other and continuing to connect with each other and, again, build new coalitions and build new systems, because I don't think we're going to be able to do much within the current framework as it is, unfortunately.
All right, and our final question of the night.
All right, well, thank you again for all your remarks. One thing that really resonated with me, I don't remember which one of you said it, was the idea of being lied to when going into church. I think not too long ago, I was one of those college students going into sort of an evangelical Christian group on campus, and the idea of like being inclusive, whereas I left the group because in some ways I didn't feel like I was truly included as an LGBT individual. So my question for you all sort of is for young people, not necessarily those in colleges, but kind of those who are just finding sort of evangelical Christianity. I grew up in a Catholic household, and something that I really liked about American evangelical churches was the fellowship, and I felt it had more of a flair than Catholicism did. So what advice do you have for young people out there who do struggle in terms of finding an inclusive church, but also kind of don't want to really push too hard, because it feels like one person against a church. And that, especially looking back as an 18-year-old, that was very scary. And so for me, my answer was kind of just leaving the group altogether. And kind of, I would like, obviously I'm a little bit older now, just a little bit older, but I would still like your advice on what would you tell a young person who's kind of struggling with finding that fellowship?
Yeah, good question.
I mean, I would say that the condition of pastors lying to people is more prevalent than we want to admit, first of all. So that is very real. I mean, most churches have a banner or some statement somewhere that says all are welcome, and the reality is it's just not true. So just right off the bat, you're already lying to people. So, I mean, practical resource, this is what we're trying to create with Church Clarity. So we're already seeing people utilizing this tool to look up a church to see if their policies are clear or not. And if not, you can submit them. It's a crowdsourced form. It takes like 1 minute, and then our team will score them. But I think technology and our ability to communicate just further helps this point, you know? And I think that's why churches are worried. They're like pastors. I have mega church pastors in my DMs stressed out about Church Clarity because they know this is like the last stand. It's like, no, you can't tell them that they're not actually welcome. And we're like, well, yes, we can, and we're going to. We don't need your permission. So that's what's beautiful about it. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful. You know, whatever church you're looking for, hopefully we've scored it.
Well, I know that our panelists are going to be around after the event tonight to talk to you a little bit more, but I'm going to hand the floor over to Britt and let her offer some closing remarks before we transition over. All
right, so these are closing remarks. I'm going to try not to preach, but it's really the one thing I do. I was thinking about this event and in our conversation, and here's just one thing I want to say, because I think it's what brings me a little bit of hope. We talked a little bit about this time being apocalyptic, and we look at stats, and we look at what's going on in the church, and there is a lot of death. And we look at sort of the harm that has been caused to a lot of people in this room, a lot of people like myself, and that requires some healing and transformation. And then I look at our actual narrative of Scripture, which is a narrative about death and rebirth. And I get extremely hopeful thinking about the idea that after death is rebirth and after crucifixion is resurrection. When I think about the revival of the church or the resurrection of the church or what's going to happen or what's going to bring new life to the church, I think about people in this room, I think about conversations like this, and I think about everyone who has had their faith tested. I always joke that like revival of the church, I believe, is going to come through the queer community and its allies, because they have had so much spiritual resiliency just to be in this room, that they have experienced transformation that I think is going to usher in a new era of Christianity in a really special way. And when we see in Scripture, right, after Jesus encounters someone and there is transformation or there is healing, he always sends them back, right? The person that's released from the demons, go back to your family. The woman at the well, go and tell these people. And I think for the people in this room, for myself, the challenge, the hope, the call, right, is the healing and transformation that you've experienced, right? You've encountered death, and then someone has shown you rebirth. You've encountered hurt, and someone has shown you healing. Well, how do we go back and show others? I think it's a really awesome opportunity. If you are in this room and you're having this conversation, you've experienced some kind of transformation. You know you're a person. You know you're a person who is worthy of sitting here. You know you're a person who is worthy of following this way of Jesus. You know you're a person who words can't take away your value. Great, let's go tell everyone else, because there are people who don't know that yet. And let's create a little bit of resurrection, because there's a lot of death going on around us.
Well, will you once again thank our panelists for joining us tonight. This has been really, really helpful. And I am going to turn the mic over.
Thank you, and let's give Jonathan a round of applause too for doing such a great job, both in his opening remarks and in moderating. Just before we close, I first of all want to thank and recognize a couple of people who made tonight happen, and that's Josh Dixon, whom some of you know, but Josh, you should let people know who you are. Josh is a consultant on this project. He's behind the scenes. He doesn't always get a lot of recognition, but he, on a week-to-week and month-to-month basis, helps us do these convenings, not just here in New York, but around the country. And then the Reverend Dr. Derek Harkins, who's the Senior Vice President for Public Programming here, who oversees all the public-facing work at Union, who's not only worked diligently to make this happen tonight, but who's also worked with the Millennial Leaders Project and its success this week as well. There are Union staff people here. I'm going to miss some folks, but I'm going to recognize our whole IT crew that has more late nights at Union than they care to think about, but I want them to know how much we appreciate them. I see Ben from Communications. I see Kevin from Development. I think I saw Robin Reese from Communications, and a few others. So I want to thank all the Union staff who've helped make this happen. And then Jonathan Soto, who's our Associate VP for Strategic Initiatives, has a quick announcement, and then we're going to let you all go home or hang around if you like and have conversations with our panelists. And thanks again to the panelists as well.
Thank you very much, Reverend Davey. And I, as an administration member that is a millennial here at Union, I am incredibly encouraged to be here, especially as a victim of religious trauma throughout my entire life that has identified as agnostic, but somehow kind of ended up in a seminary space. I grew up Pentecostal, Puerto Rican. For any of our folks here know that rajatabla is a hyper-conservative kind of centering of dominionist theology that I was trying to run away from my entire life. And there was an element of religious trauma that pushed me away from the church and brought me towards the kind of sphere of public policy. So part of my training and background is in law and also in government. And in government here in New York City, we were able to start a survey as I worked as a senior advisor to the mayor here to understand where our homeless youth, specifically LGBTQ youth, after doing a survey in our homeless shelters, to identify what were some of the issues that brought them to homelessness, what were some of the issues that pushed them towards the edge and leaving their families and really going into probably one of the worst shelter systems in the world, which is New York City. And what we found through our informal kind of engagement, and as the person that was leading the efforts at City Hall on faith engagement, we saw that over 70% in our informal study of young people that were in the shelter system that identified as LGBTQ+, identified as being homeless because of religious alienation. Religious alienation. What lots of folks fail to understand about New York City, the progressive, inclusive, whatever city that exists here, is that many of our faith communities lack the tools and lack the language in knowing how to deal and how to grapple with issues that they are not equipped to deal with. And as we know, as like the diaspora center and immigration center of the world, many of our faith communities, especially our Black and brown communities, don't have the language to be able to grapple and deal with congregants that may express these anxieties. And part of the work that we did at the mayor's office and when I transitioned here to Union was to think about how can we think about equipping our not only seminarians with tools, but be able to serve maybe as chaplains that can go into homeless shelters and homeless spaces to be able to engage in relational communication with these individuals that may not understand that there are individuals that identify as people of faith that could begin to deconstruct the elements of discrimination that may exist in their houses of worship and find a pace of respite here in New York City. And that is why we here at Union Seminary are partnering with the First Lady's efforts here, Shirlane McCrae, on what is called the Unity Project. And the Unity Project is something that everyone pays attention to here, and I encourage you to please keep checking in on our efforts, because what we're launching here is really a chaplaincy program where our seminarians are able to create scripts, create language, create curriculum, create different methodologies of working with faith communities that may alienate individuals and folks, but sending our best and our brightest to these shelters to be able to let folks know that Jesus loves them, to be able to understand that not only beyond loving them, that there is something sacred in one's identity. Our methodology is based on Ecclesiastes 3:11 that states that the Creator has made everything beautiful in its time and has set eternity upon the hearts of all people. But the coda of that verse, people not knowing the work of God from beginning to end, is what is leading to the further alienation of our individuals and our folks here that are suffering from religious trauma. So we're starting a program with FCBC, First Corinthian Baptist Church. I don't know if folks know what First Corinthian Baptist Church here is on 116th in Amsterdam. You should definitely visit. And they've created what's called the Hope Center. The Hope Center is led from their Pastor Reverend Kendra Frazier, who is an LGBTQ identifying faith leader, who has launched a program that reimagines the way we engage on the issue of group therapy, intersection of homelessness, and also of mental illness, and also working with the Columbia School of Social Work to understand ways that we could reach folks that have been inflicted by religious trauma, and how do we best equip our seminarians with the tool to shift public policy. And public policy is something that you should be thinking about as you transition into your careers post-seminary or post-ministry. Because what we're seeing is that the 19th century was the century of empire, 20th of nation states, and the 21st of city states. The way we engage with local government, and I think someone just mentioned this here, if we can impact our local government to see that anti-LGBTQ policies, specifically from our faith communities, are leading to a suicide and mental health crisis, that could be an entry point for us to start pushing and advocating and use our prophetic voices to shift the paradigm. So I just wanted to encourage you to please check in if you're interested in the project. We will be launching it soon in September with fellowships and chaplaincies that direct engagely with the homelessness system here in New York City to ensure that there is a equipped in the focus of groups and seminarians here at Union that are able to bridge this gap that we're seeing in New York City. I came here because of that specific work. I encourage you to keep following the work that we're doing here, and I just want to thank you for coming from far and wide to engage with us here, and we're looking forward to engaging you tomorrow and the rest of the day. So thank you, God bless you, and feel free to come by and chat if you're interested in learning more about the program. Thank you, Reverend.
Thank you. Jonathan didn't move very far from his Pentecostal roots, so I think you can see that. Thank you. Have a good night. Thanks.